Hello, and welcome back to Video Games. I'm Tim Rogers. You are watching the Kotaku.com review of 1994. The year. I specify the year because otherwise you would assume that someone had made a game called 1994. That is the sort of name that an independent developer would give a video game. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times, is the first sentence of Charles Dickens's 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities, which we had to read in my English literature class 135 years later in 1994. As Charles Dickens said of London and Paris of 1775, 84 years later in 1859, as I read 135 years later in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1994, so I say 25 years later in 2019 of video games and my life in 1994. 1994 was the best of times to play video games and the worst of times to be me personally. I won't mince words. In 1994, I was a sweatpants-wearing, Frankenstein-haired, morbidly obese, myopic bullying victim who spent almost as much time feeling sorry for myself as I spent thinking about video games. Likewise, video games spent about as much time feeling sorry for themselves as they spent thinking about video games. As I waited with increasing impatience for my own puberty, video games were right in the middle of theirs. 3 and 4 years previous, the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis had arrived. 1 year after 1994, we would have the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. 2 years later, we would have Super Mario 64. 1 year before the hardware madness of 1995 began its yet unceasing explosion, we had 1994, a year of revisionism, not of innovation, a year of refinement, not of reinvention, a year of technical mastery, not of technological advancement. 1994 was a year for game design. In 1996, we would have Super Mario 64. In 1994, we had Donkey Kong Country. In 1996, we would have Quake. In 1994, we had Doom 2. Actually, this quote about Doom 2 from Wikipedia just about says everything that I'm going to use the remainder of the running time of this video to say in far more flowery prose. Doom 2 was not dramatically different from its predecessor. There were no major technological developments, graphical improvements, or substantial gameplay changes. Instead, the development team took advantage of advances in computer hardware since the release of the original game that allowed them to do more with their game engine by making much larger and more intricate levels. For video games, 1994 certainly contained all the awkwardness of a puberty. In 1994, they made a Pac-Man 2, and it was a point-and-click adventure game for consoles. In 1994, 2 completely different video games called Vortex came out. In 1994, Nintendo followed up Star Fox with Stunt Race FX. In 1994, Konami called the second game in the Rocket Knight Adventures series Sparkster, as though someone's mom somewhere knew the name of that possum. In 1994, Mortal Kombat brought bloody violence to Nintendo consoles, only to squander this milestone with unimaginative fatalities such as Johnny Cage just grabbing his opponent's torso and joylessly ripping it off. In 1994, a few baby boomers somewhere became aware of Street Fighter II, and so Shaq learned Shaq Fu. Michael Jordan, meanwhile, took aim on the other famous Jumpman and starred in a platform action game of his own, Chaos in the Windy City. 1 year before 1994, we had a Super Mario Bros. The movie. In 1994, Beavis and Butthead starred in a point-and-click adventure-like game on the Sega Genesis. In 1994, Electronic Arts literally made a video game about the perhaps fabricated fad of gripping a stranger's car bumper while wearing rollerblades. Yet, unlike my own erstwhile puberty, 1994 saw video games blossom in hundreds of gorgeous ways. For every soul-lacking, drummed-up mascot platformer like Michael Jordan Chaos in the Windy City, we had one cute platformer like Umihara Kawase, starring a little girl with a pink backpack and a fishing rod. For every trashy Mortal Kombat wannabe, we had two genre-stretching Japanese action-adventures. To wit, two top-down Japanese action-adventure games about firefighters came out in 1994. Today, we have a new Call of Duty every year. In 1994, if you said shooting game, someone might have thought you were talking about an over-the-shoulder two-player co-op shooting gallery game about a cowboy, a cowgirl, and various evil anime steampunk robots. As the year 2019 draws to a close, I find myself looking back at video games. Many great games came out this year, sure, though also many video game developers, publishers, critics, and historians tweeted many tweets this year about such and such game's 25th anniversary. Anyone who, like me, owns the habit of paying too much attention to literally everything, much to the detriment of their own comfort, should be coming to the end of this year thinking less about their top 10 best games of the year, and more about, wow, there sure were a lot of 25th anniversaries this year. So today, I would like to present to you what I have carefully calculated to be the 25 best games released in 1994. My ranking process required me to walk a fine line between sentimentality and science. 9 times out of 10, if you asked me to write a ranked list of historically important items, I would prefer to go with my personal preferential instinct over performing any kind of mathematical calculation regarding historical significance. Like, when a publication does a list of the 100 best games of all time and they put like Tetris at the top, that's more boring to me than putting, for example, Doom at the top. Tetris looks like a choice a computer made. Doom looks like a choice a person made. However, as I composed this list, I found it interesting that a lot of my favorite games from 1994 turned out to be historically significant. So, despite being a year of incremental improvements rather than blustery, thunderous hardware explosion, it turns out that 1994 was an uber year for great video games. It's almost as though the end of a console generation is better than the beginning of a console generation. It's almost as though we make better games when we're not thinking about making bigger games. It's almost as though incremental refinements are true innovation. Either that, or I'm taking a really long time to say video games actually have not changed that much. At any rate, let's get started with number 25, MotorToon Grand Prix. Before Cuphead, before Forza, before Gran Turismo, before Mario Kart 64, MotorToon Grand Prix did not try to be all or even any of those. MotorToon Grand Prix came out 2 weeks after the launch of the PlayStation in Japan, and nobody yelling about it on the other side of the Pacific was yelling loudly enough for me to hear. Die-hard game fan hyperventilated about it for a bit, though by then I'd learned to ignore most of die-hard game fans' hyperventilations. At any rate, none of us could have possibly known back then that the developers of MotorToon Grand Prix would go on to change driving games forever with Gran Turismo in 1998. After Gran Turismo, MotorToon Grand Prix became a favorite in Did You Know circles. Its power as a trivia item squatted in the back of my brain long enough for me to acquire a copy for less than $1 a couple years later in Japan. I put it on one day on a whim, thinking I'd get my less than $1 worth. It turns out it completely owns everything that its developers would need to crank out Gran Turismo sleeps in MotorToon Grand Prix's prehistorically simple action-gamey race flow. It turns out that the zeitgeist of 1994 and the upcoming hardware madness of 1995 perfectly encapsulates the entirety of an opportunity window in which video game developers very well could have replaced mascot platformers with mascot racing games. MotorToon Grand Prix's curious mixture of cartoons, cars, tunes, and flat polygons lend it a look worthy of thousands of retweets in GIF form by circa 2019 indie video game developers. Number 24. Urban Strike. Urban Strike is not as good as Jungle Strike, though you know what? I didn't care. In 1994, I loved helicopters about as much as I love helicopters in 2019, and Urban Strike was a game about helicopters. I had already squeezed every last drop of hot milk from the stone of Jungle Strike, so I hunkered down and slaked my thirst on a long weekend with a rented copy of Urban Strike. One could say that Urban Strike thus had a textural sensation not unlike the DLC of today. That would be a stretch, though this whole video might as well be a yoga class, so let's allow it. Urban Strike taught me that a game could disappoint me on some critical instinctual level, yet still stand worthy of my wolfing down of every grisly morsel. Today, we can look back at the Strike series as pioneers of two aspects. First, their gargantularge level maps and freeform mission objective punctuation laid the groundwork for Grand Theft Auto, which planted the flag of the modern open-world game design disease. Second, it had helicopters. Not enough games today have helicopters. Helicopters are better than cars. Flying a helicopter in third person is better than running around with a rifle in first person. In 1994, I played all the way through two games about helicopters, Urban Strike and Choplifter 3. Well, 3 if you count Wing War. In 2019, I got nothing. Number 23. Donkey Kong Country. Late in 1994, Nintendo published this little side-scrolling platform game, marking the historical occasion of their allowing a Western developer access to their precious intellectual property. It is great to love Donkey Kong Country for nostalgia reasons, though I hope that even its most supportive fans can agree that it offered little in the way of innovation for the platforming genre. Yet I make the decision to place it here on my list instead of a much better platforming game like Umi Harakawase, because Donkey Kong Country also represented a colossally massive marketing event. You could not flip open a phone book-thick issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly in 1994 without your eyeballs tripping over a paragraph about how they used the same computers to model Donkey Kong that they used to make the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. Mainstream Toys R Us video games were suddenly high-tech in a buzzwordy, local TV newsy way that PC games had confidently never bothered to be. Number 22. Monster World 4. I confess I did not know about this game until many years after 1994. When I finally played it, it opened a back door in my brain. Monster World 4 enlightened me to reasons and machinations behind many of the PlayStation-era games that I had loved. While other developers chased trends and refined their own classics, the makers of Monster World 4 polished half-baked, discarded relics. At the time I first played it, Monster World 4 reminded me of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, Legacy of the Wizard, Faxanadu, Battle for Olympus, and other underloved NES games. It is a heavier, harder, more brutal action role-playing game than most people must have wanted in its day. Where other games in soon-to-come later years would adopt Zelda-like breeziness and accessibility, Monster World 4 eschewed the very notion of player-friendliness in favor of heavy action techniques possessing density that could drown a Castlevania protagonist. To any modernly trained sensibility, its dedication to easygoing cartoon storytelling might seem at odds with its brutal dungeon designs. Though if we look at it through the lens of 1994, we might sympathize with its developers. There really was a chance something this angry yet beautiful could have taken off. In 2019 and forever, it's a masterpiece. Back in 1994, my favorite American video game magazines didn't even blip it as an import-only curiosity. Coming in at number 21, Blackthorn. Blackthorn is out of this world, the video game. It proved to me in 1994 that level design was, in fact, an art form. Blackthorn distilled the cinematic aspirations of Out of This World and Flashback into a distinctly video-gamey experience. 1 year earlier, Blackthorn's team had made Lost Vikings, an undeniable classic. We probably wouldn't have any puzzle platformers were it not for the Lost Vikings. Maybe that's not the worst thing. 25 years later, Blackthorn's developers are Blizzard, and they made Overwatch, World of Warcraft, and Diablo. Also in 1994, Eric Chahi released Heart of the Alien, a sequel to his classic Out of This World. Though 25 years later, visionaries like Fumito Ueda and Hideo Kojima will cite Out of This World as one of their biggest influences. The level design scientist in me sees a lot more to love about Blackthorn's sticky action mechanics. You can hide in the shadows, you can fire your shotgun behind your back. In the same year that they released Blackthorn for Super Nintendo and DOS, Blizzard also released Warcraft: Orcs and Humans for DOS. Both Blackthorn and Warcraft were incremental refinements of existing video game genres, possessing a scarce few examples each. Maybe a fool would not have been able to notice a pattern looking at these two games, though anyone compelled to compare the microscopic game design differences between Blackthorn and Flashback would have immediately declared that Blizzard was going places. Number 20. Sonic
and Knuckles.
Sonic and Knuckles is the best Sonic the Hedgehog game. For those keeping score, Sonic Mania is the second best Sonic the Hedgehog game, and Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is the third best Sonic the Hedgehog game. Anyone who says they like the original Sonic the Hedgehog game the most is a liar. Anyone who says the best Sonic the Hedgehog is Sonic 3 and Knuckles is a narc. Sonic and Knuckles is the best Sonic the Hedgehog game because it has the best level design geometry. For a video game series that situates almost its entire charm around the very concept of joyfully moving forward at a higher speed than most human eyes can comfortably read, the level design geometry is always going to be the trickiest part to get right. Sonic and Knuckles was the fourth mainline Sonic the Hedgehog game, if we don't count Sonic CD, which we shouldn't because I didn't have a Sega CD and you probably didn't either, and if you did have a Sega CD, you were a cop. Sonic & Knuckles was the fourth mainline Sonic the Hedgehog game and the last 2D one for a long time. By the time Sega decided to again dedicate themselves readily to the Sonic the Hedgehog business, the game industry was trending toward all 3D all the time. So Sonic & Knuckles perhaps encapsulates the spirit of 1994 as succinctly as any of the other games on this list ever did. Sonic & Knuckles was the fourth main game in its series, and the second game in that series released in the same calendar year. It was the last 2D entry in a series that later went 3D. It sported a strong gimmick. You could connect other Sonic the Hedgehog games to add the character Knuckles to them as though by magic. This form of glorious, unique, one-of-a-kind, materialized DLC also expresses the spirit of 1994-ish iterationism. The lock-on cartridge, as they called it, perhaps represents the ultimate example of employment of extreme thoughtful care in implementing a minor addition, which sort of breaks the game. And if you're still keeping score, yes, I love playing Sonic and Knuckles' original levels as Sonic. All I'll say about Knuckles right now is he's more fun to play than Donkey Kong Country. Number 19. Daytona, USA. At the time I first saw 8 linked-up Daytona USA cabinets at the local block party, that was an arcade chain, not a social event, by the way, I was the sort of amateur, grunge-listening 1990s teenager who hated their hometown by default. After I saw and played Daytona USA, well, I can't say that I fell in love with my hometown. Not 7 years later, I would leave my hometown and never return outside of a few scattered holiday seasons. However, Daytona did bless me with one mystic notion. For all my antisocial disdain for Indianapolis, Indiana, and its storied traditional loves of high school basketball and yearly motorsports, I could not help looking at Daytona USA and suddenly deciding that NASCAR was pretty cool. In school, I knew of many loud meatheads who liked NASCAR one way. Daytona USA proved to me that some other people, 10,000 miles distant from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, had discovered another method for expressing appreciation for NASCAR. The confrontationally bold confidence of Daytona USA's presentation convinced me to set shame aside for a second and assess the scope of NASCAR's game design as a sport. To this day, I love NASCAR. I own many richly vintage NASCAR t-shirts. This never would have happened had Daytona not wooed me with its bizarre music, its luxurious typography, that Sonic the Hedgehog cameo, and the opportunity to provably drive a stick shift better and faster than my taller, older brother. Here at number 18, Beyond Oasis, or The Story of Thor. The only two things I love as much as Zelda games are 2D Zelda games and weird Sega-published 2D Zelda-likes. The only thing I love as much as weird Sega-published 2D Zelda-likes is, of course, Alundra. Weird Sega-published 2D Zelda-likes: Magic Knight Rayearth, Linkle Liver Story, Landstalker, Light Crusader, Shining Wisdom, Crusader of Senti, and Beyond Oasis, all turned my 1990s brain into a forest fire of possibilities. Top-down, sword-swinging action-adventure games for a brief flicker of a moment before first-person shooters became a thing felt like the future. Just when I thought Zelda: Link to the Past and Link's Awakening had shown me the full depth of the genre, we had Landstalker. 1 year later, we had Beyond Oasis, with its lush cartoon animations, its crispy music, and its stylish, hot, sharp, brawler-inspired action. Sega published Beyond Oasis as The Story of Thor on the Mega Drive in Japan a week after Sony launched the original PlayStation in Japan in December of 1994. Beyond Oasis did not come out in the West until 1995, which is when I played it. I'm going to go ahead and include it in my list anyway, because it offers me a perfect opportunity to nonchalantly segue into my next entry. Number 17. Crusader of Senti. Released in Japan as Ragna Senti, released in Europe as Soleil. Critique constructors employed at Western video game enthusiast periodicals in 1994 unanimously described Crusader of Senti as a Link to the Past clone. And maybe that's fair. I mean, look at it. Though in action, it showed me a fast, smooth, and freaky alternate universe Zelda with something different at the guts of its design. Crusader of Senti is a game so underrated, I have even underrated it myself. I rented and blasted through it in a weekend back during the summer of 1994. My biggest takeaway then was that I liked Landstalker better for its bigger scale, broader adventure, and nastier puzzles. However, at some point 10 years after playing Crusader of Senti, I felt a sudden hunger for it. This hunger might have had something to do with meeting Kan Naito, the director of Landstalker, and talking to him about some of his favorite games. I played Landstalker with the director of Landstalker, and at one point while playing Landstalker with the director of Landstalker, the director of Landstalker said, apropos of nothing, and I swear I'm not making this up, "Have you ever played Ragna Senti? That game's good." And I said, "Yeah, I've played it. It is very good." To which he replied, "The thing about Ragna Senti is, they got the action right in ways Zelda never has." Thus encouraged, I bought a used copy of Ragna Senti from Mega Drive and took my time. So, 15 years after that experience, when I say alternate universe Zelda, I mean it. Zelda games have been action games as long as they have been Zelda games. Crusader of Senti goes all in on exploring the action aspect. Look at this silky smooth 60 FPS frame rate, and you will know the designers cared more about video game action than they probably did about real-life breathing. Crusader of Senti has got some arcade shooter-worthy projectile action. It also has some Japanese role-playing game-worthy subsystems like equipable pseudo-AI pet partners. That's before Pokemon, by the way. You know what Game Freak was doing while the developers of Crusader of Senti were developing Crusader of Senti? They made Pulse Man for the Sega Mega Drive in Japan. I replayed a lot of Crusader of Senti this week into my office, and I watched a lot of Ricky C's long play of it on YouTube. And yes, the game is a little bit rough, though playing it constantly reminded me of how many great ideas this game had. Crusader of Senti raises its hand in the back of class, dying to be recognized. Imagine a world where we'd had more Zelda clones. However, Crusader of Senti had unfortunately brought a dodgeball to a basketball court. It turns out that innovation in off-brand Zelda game design was not exactly a college course anyone wanted to sign up for in 1994. I wish I had evangelized this game on social media more over the past decade, because I now know that some of the people in charge of selecting games for the American Genesis Mini follow me on Twitter. Viewers, I have failed you all. And Sega, if you're listening, can I get a Sega Ages Crusader of Senti? Number 16. System Shock. My first impression of System Shock was that the dudes working at the video game store were proud of it when I went in to pre-order Donkey Kong Country. The first time someone spoke to me of System Shock's goodness, it was in college, and all they had to say was, "Dude, System Shock rules, dude." In addition to gracefully preceding System Shock 2, System Shock gloriously presented 1994's older game likers a robust three-dimensional game of narrative choices and densely hard-to-pin-down sci-fi themes. It would be several years before we had Deus Ex, and more than a decade until BioShock. And right here, for people who'd cashed in enough of their life savings on PC parts, was a big video game that was legitimately about something more than pointing, clicking, or shooting. Number 15 right here, The Elder Scrolls Arena. When I think of Bethesda's first Elder Scrolls game, I remember low ceilings and slow feelings. A first-person perspective so rudimentary, it fostered an atmosphere of shocking dread, freedom to go many places and do many things, which amounted most profoundly as a freedom to get lost. I did not play Arena until 1997, and by then I'd already played Daggerfall. Though when you look at the two games in juxtaposition, you can see the beginning of the beautiful arc of iteration that sustains this series even today. Arena showed us a crusty old Bard's Tale-like wizardry-style role-playing game with a hint of that techno juice that had begun to fuel the day's elementary first-person shooters. That spurt of juice sufficed to kindle many imaginations. Arena was a video game whose very presence on a store shelf in a shopping mall in Indianapolis, Indiana, told any onlookers that a lot of really good video games lurked just around the future's corner. Number 14. Shin Megami Tensei 2. Oh, I actually did not write a blurb for this one. I meant to write a blurb for this one. I had very strong feelings about it, and this document is huge. It's a very long, giant, sprawling document that I'm reading from. Maybe I'll type something later and come back in here and read it and then put it into the video, or maybe I should just freestyle something right now. Does everybody want to hear what it's like when I just freestyle something off the top of my head instead of meticulously writing it down with Q-tips on my keyboard and then reading it in my slow, weird, lecture-y voice? Shin Megami Tensei 2 came out in 1994 in Japan, and we knew nothing about it in the United States of America, and I don't know if anybody knew anything about it in Europe either. None of my favorite magazines mentioned it, and they were always talking about Japanese role-playing games that were maybe never going to come out in the United States. So it's a little bit suspect that they never talked about it. I actually never learned about the Shin Megami Tensei series until I learned about Persona 1, which websites that I liked, such as the Gaming Intelligence Agency or theGIA.com, shout out to any former GIA readers or staff members who are listening to this. These sorts of early live journal era video game bloggers were bonk-a-hog with recommendationalizing Persona 1. A lot of these bloggers went so far as to name drop the Shin Megami Tensei series. I'm not sure if any of them had actually played it or if they just wanted to look cool, because I know that I just wanted to look cool at that time, and they were about the same age as me. I played the heck off of the first Persona game when it was released for the PlayStation, and I beat the trash off of the second Persona game when it came out later. Back then, I was pretty newly aware of emulation, so I tracked down some of the early Shin Megami Tensei games because I was such a huge fan of these Persona games that I'd been playing. And I've got to say, I did not know any Japanese, much less enough Japanese to understand anything about Shin Megami Tensei 2 for the Super Famicom. I stumbled around in it for a bit, decided that I liked Persona better, and then did not return to the game until I had moved to Japan several years later and purchased a used copy of it for the Super Famicom. I looked at the game in an emulator earlier this week, and it's just, there it is, it's all there. Everything that anyone has ever liked about any of the Persona or Shin Megami Tensei games is all there in 1994. You have all that weird, wild, chocolate cake density lore, where like the city of Tokyo has been completely buried beneath a recent history-level apocalypse. It just shows to go you that all the way back in 1994, these goddarn game designers were out there, and they were making exactly the sorts of games that they would become famous for making and continue to be famous for making. These people brought a legend directly out of their brains and began working on it. They did not build up to it over the course of many years during which they acquired curiosities and curios from various extraneous locations. They just made this thing. And it's modern, and it's beautiful, and you're going to yell at me for mentioning its name, though I'm going to say it. We wouldn't have stuff like Dark Souls without this. The end. And let me know how you liked my improvisation there. And here's number 13, Streets of Rage 3, or Bare Knuckle 3. Streets of Rage 3 is better than Streets of Rage 2. It's faster. The action is harder. The design systems stack up more intricately. Every character can sprint with a double tap. Do you want to know why people like Streets of Rage 2 more? Reason number 1, it's better than Streets of Rage 1. Reason number 2, because the music track in the first stage of Streets of Rage 2 is phenomenal. Finally, because the first stage in Streets of Rage 2 is an actual street. The story crawl of Streets of Rage 2 lays out a narrative about a simple kidnapping. For any teenager who had ever seen a Hollywood film, Streets of Rage 2's story was relatable-ish as far as 1990s video games go. Well, on the other hand, in the spirit of 1994, Streets of Rage 3 opens with our brawler heroes loudly attempting to defuse a nuclear bomb with their fists inside some hybrid of a meat locker and an industrial music club with a more muted color palette than usual. Streets of Rage 2 grows a little stale as it goes on. Streets of Rage 3 shrilly unfolds with shockingly sick battles and monumentally ahead of its time, grisly, grotesque, hard-edged electronic music. Here again crouches the most syrupy essence of 1994. As much darker, harder, sharper, colder, more technical, more refined, more cuisine-like, and more crystalline in its self-confidence than its predecessors, as it is underappreciated in every modern comparison. Also, the music is better. If you don't agree, give it another 25 years. Number 12, Live Alive. All the way back in 1994, before you could even download a video game, much less download content for a video game, long before anyone had ever referred to a game as episodic, there was Live Alive. I am pronouncing that correctly, by the way. I made sure I looked exactly at the katakana under the name on the Japanese box. Live Alive occurs as a sort of a Japanese role-playing game greatest hits album by a non-existent band. Uniquely for its day, and uniquely for right now, Live Alive presented multiple brief role-playing scenario episodes, each set in a seemingly different world, each wildly different in narrative scope, each assuming a different genre of fiction. In 1994, it appealed to me on thrift value alone. 7 games for the price of 1. Unfortunately, I was unable to play it until I moved to Japan and learned Japanese. If you've never played Live Alive, I can forgive you for presuming that its 7 thematically diverse chapters probably add up to a buffet-style experience. You know, the food isn't as good at a lunch buffet as it'd be if you ordered off the dinner menu. Though when I eventually played the game, it delighted me to learn its 7 chapters actually play off one another like fine dining courses in a manner that has no modern analog. Also, 12 years later, the designer of Live Alive, Nobuyuki Inoue, would go on to direct the similarly cuisine-like, ultra-cohesively episodic Japanese role-playing game masterpiece, Mother 3. Number 11. Wing War. I always wanted to be a pilot. You might have noticed this if you have ever seen me in person, because I was probably wearing one of my fancy flight jackets that I hope to someday be cremated in. My hunger for the blue yonder is so prolific that I knew of the optometric requirements of the pilot's trade even at age 4. I'm being serious. When my dad accidentally drove my mom's 1979 Ford Thunderbird off an icy bridge on Groundhog Day, 1984, and I looked up into the rearview mirror afterward to see my right eye had literally exited my skull, my first thought was that maybe I wouldn't have 20/20 vision anymore, and thus I could never become an Air Force pilot. Well, 10 years after that, in 1994, I didn't even have 20/20 vision in my left eye either, so Sega's Wing War arcade game was a comfortable enough solution for the problem of my career aspirations. I loved Wing War even more than I'd loved Virtua Racing, more than I loved Daytona USA. Wing War's controls were stuck halfway between simulation and arcade game. Its gregariously simple game flow asked me only to obliterate my opponent. Slower than Doom and faster than chess, Sega's Wing War let me throttle my 20/20 vision having big brother so hard he would quit video games almost immediately afterward. And Wing War had a helicopter. Today, I often think back on it and wonder after an alternate present in which Wing War had really taken off. have supplanted fighting games and real-time strategy and become the seed sower of modern esports. Here we go. Number 10. Castlevania Bloodlines. Castlevania Bloodlines is my favorite Castlevania game. 4 years before Castlevania Symphony of the Night ripped off Super Metroid and somehow began taking credit for inventing non-linear 2D side-scrolling action-adventure games, and 1 year after Dracula X Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine CD represented the absolute apex of old-fashioned Castlevania heavy action game design, Castlevania Bloodlines tried something uniquely different. Bloodlines presents us a breezy, leisurely, fast-paced, wackier, less logistical sensical Castlevania. One of the main characters has a spear. It's got some of the tricky button input technical actions of Rondo of Blood, and it's also got some of Symphony of the Night's lightness and speed. Perhaps most historical significantly, Castlevania Bloodlines marks the first big example I can remember of game name, subtitle. The subtitle in this case stood in for a number because Bloodlines was Konami's first Castlevania game for Sega Genesis after years of fealty to Nintendo. Konami didn't want to put a number in the title because they didn't want to confuse kids who only got Sega consoles for Christmas. Also, probably because even Konami did not understand Castlevania's plot timeline. And number 9. Sensible World of Soccer. First, let me apologize. What you see here is actually Sensible Soccer International Edition for the Mega Drive, not Sensible World of Soccer for the Amiga. I couldn't find any good footage of the Amiga game, and I didn't have the 6 hours necessary to boot up an Amiga emulator. I thought of asking Bennett Foddy for help, though I figure he's busy. Sensible World of Soccer is a sequel to Sensible Soccer. Sensible Soccer sits near or at the top of every Amiga game recommender's list. When I was working on a hyper-accessible, minimalist sports game of my own in 2011, I did a deep research dive into simple sports games. My thesis as a game designer was that sports games could be action games, and that the action gaminess could feed sublimely into the technical sports depth. So with the help of game design history mavens like Bennett Foddy, I looked at some older sports games, action-like sports games, and sports-like action games. I looked at Cyberball, Powerball, and Projectile. Bennett Foddy strongly recommended Sensible Soccer. I almost died from how much Sensible Soccer impressed me. With a little elbow grease, I recommended Sensible Soccer's 1994 sequel, Sensible World of Soccer, to myself. Perhaps nowhere else in the entire history of video games can we see such a sublime blend of accessible action game action and sports simulatory depth. Sensible World of Soccer shows that games can bridge unseen understanding gaps in sports. Later sports games would acquire greater graphics. Real-time strategy games, which were only just getting started in 1994, would later grow in complexity until they were regarded as sports unto themselves. Meanwhile, Sensible World of Soccer sleeps here role model-esque, perfectly embodying simplicity and simulation, even 2.5 decades hence. Number 8. Contra Hardcore. A few months after Castlevania Bloodlines, Konami released Contra Hardcore on the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Like Castlevania Bloodlines, Contra Hardcore represents the historical first entry of one of Konami's famous series on Sega's 16-bit console. Like Castlevania Bloodlines, Contra Hardcore has a colon in its title. Like Castlevania Bloodlines, Contra Hardcore taints the formula of its Nintendo cousins with blazing wild 60 FPS uniqueness. We could say that Bloodlines and Hardcore are 1994 in a nutshell. Incremental changes to an established formula applied with texturally transformative results. Perhaps in an effort to differentiate itself from Contra 3, The Alien Wars, or perhaps in an effort to contend with the 1993 Sega Genesis born classic Gunstar Heroes by Treasure, Hardcore offered apocalyptically branching plots. Contra Hardcore is home of some of the weirdest, wildest, most memorable, structural, visual, and game design-related humor in video game history. So it amounts to a fittingly 1994ian tragedy that designer-director Nobuya Nakazato never quite became a household name. Here's number 7. Elevator Action returns. Few games wield the confidence of Elevator Action Returns. Boldly attaching the word returns to the end of the title of a game whose only and previous entry came out 11 years prior took elephant-sized balloon guts. In shocking, then modern contrast to its then ancient predecessor, Elevator Action returned with dystopian, photo-like grit, wallpapering its previous pixel-arty simplicity. In subversive defiance of expectations, much of the action, in fact, took place outside of elevators. Shedding the heft of old-timey friction palaces like Castlevania, action games of 1994 had begun a trend toward lightness and breezy speed, unto a world that would receive its third and fourth entries in the mainline Sonic the Hedgehog series in that same year. Elevator Action returned with all the glorious, angry heaviness of its foreparent. I first experienced the arcade version of the game at Hirose Entertainment Yard, HEY, or HEY, in Akihabara, Tokyo, Japan in November of 2001. In early 2002, I purchased a used Sega Saturn, and the Sega Saturn version of the game released in 1995. Though even in 2001, even 7 years after its initial arcade release, the mightiness of Elevator Action Returns was apparent. Here is a game that will forever lurk modernly, right down to its typography. Now 25 years after its release, my love for this game has grown to hideous size. I wish it were available on more consoles. Wherever, whenever, I hunger for its simplicity. Here is a game I could put on any time and play through it like I'm listening to a favorite album. All I've ever wanted to do in the video game industry is make a similar game to this one. I might even be doing that right now. Heck, I even officially pitched Taito on a sequel to this once. We don't have to talk about that right now, though. Number 6. Policenauts. As of 1994, I had only been able to observe the video game Snatcher on my mom's friend's son's Sega CD. The kid would not let me touch the controller while the Sega CD was turned on. He made crude jokes and experimented with R-rated language as he plunked around ineptly in the game. The kid knew every fatality in Mortal Kombat. He was the type of kid who would yell,
"No, stop, I want to do the fatality,"
when you were about to beat him. I'll admit I had never specifically envied anyone before I had to watch that kid play Snatcher. Before I had even had a chance to play Snatcher myself, my favorite magazines were already whispering glossily about Policenauts. Policenauts was, according to these floppy, heavy printed telegrams, a game by the same guy who made Snatcher. I remember thinking, so a Snatcher is like a Terminator and a Body Snatcher, and a Policenaut is like a police officer who's also an astronaut? I knew that someday I would play both games and that I would love them. I eventually did play them, and I did love them, and I loved Policenauts more, though by the time I played them, I had already both played Metal Gear Solid and learned the name Hideo Kojima. Policenauts shows us Hideo Kojima millimeters from Metal Gear Solid, 25 years before Death Stranding, 10 years after he gave up trying to publish novels and went into game development. Policenauts stands at a historical crossroads in video game creativity. It is bookish, gamish, and filmish. It is so filmish that the main characters are pretty much exactly anime Mel Gibson and Danny Glover from Lethal Weapon. Policenauts is huge. It brims with words and ideas. It overflows with science-fictional jargon of both borrowed and invented varieties. Yet it is also briskly paced and refreshingly playable. Thinking about Policenauts in the year of Death Stranding sends me into a bittersweet reverie. We all know that Hideo Kojima has been making games since the 1980s, though thinking about Policenauts in 2019 brings to light that Hideo Kojima has been making Hideo Kojima games since at least 1994. Yes, I'm insinuating that Snatcher might not exactly be a Hideo Kojima game. It is hard to recommend you play Policenauts now without condoning a little piracy, so take that as an encouragement. If you can get the various emulators working, there is a fan translation patch. Prepare for a wild, precious experience. And number 5. The Ninja Warriors. The Ninja Warriors is the best beat-them-up video game of all time. As I've said numerous times during this list, video game designers as of 1994 had begun the first phase of a hard, veery swerve toward breezy, light, mainstream accessibility. Now, this swerve would broaden audiences drastically. It would bring in hundreds of thousands and then millions of players. Though for a sweet moment in 1994, several designers still clung to the heavy, slow awkwardness of the old times. In no other game does drudgy heft lurk quite so Herculean as in the Ninja Warriors for Super Nintendo. In Japan, it was called The Ninja Warriors again because it's technically a remake of an arcade game called The Ninja Warriors, though you know what? I don't like the arcade game. On the other hand, I love the Super Nintendo game. I could talk about this game for 6 consecutive hours. Colleges, book my lecture. You have my number, and if you don't have my number, well, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. For now, let me just say that I felt genuinely sad to see critics call The Ninja Warriors' original development team's beautiful 2019 remake Ninja Saviors Return of the Warriors slow and bland. It's neither slow nor bland. It's meticulous and strict. When you press a button, you have to make sure that you will have wanted to have pressed that button. In 1994, Ninja Warriors saw that the beat-them-up genre used vertical multiplane movement as a crutch. In Ninja Warriors, you're locked to one plane. This means you can crouch. You can also jump, hold the attack button to block. Utilizing poetically elegant state machines and controller cords, Ninja Warriors milks a tiny quantity of buttons for maximum technical action. It would take the collective video game developers of the world 24 years to craft another game as heavy, slow, and hot hard as this, if not as good. Yeah, I'm talking about Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a cowboy game, not unlike the Ninja Warriors' developers' other 1994 game, Wild Guns. Number 4. Super Metroid. Nowadays, when someone remakes a game or pays it stylistic tribute, they embellish the old object until its ancient nature becomes smooth and shiny. For example, Shovel Knight shows you an 8-bit platform action-adventure game that looks exactly like Capcom's DuckTales to someone who has not played Capcom's DuckTales since 1989. I point this out because this trick works even on me. I love a prosaically old, stylistic visual aesthetic. I like letting my nostalgia win. 25 years since the release of Super Metroid, 2 facts stick out. First is that almost every game now has some Super Metroid lodged in it somewhere, like a splinter. Second is that when Super Metroid came out, it didn't remind me of anything. And I had played all the way through Metroid on the NES in 1988. I don't even know how I did it. The original Metroid was excruciatingly hard, and it took me a long time. I had even played Metroid 2, The Return of Samus on my Game Boy, because there was something wrong with me. My eyes still hurt. Yet when I rented it, clicked it into my Super Nintendo, and booted it up in April of 1994, Super Metroid presented me personally not a milliliter of nostalgia nectar. As I played it, Super Metroid awoke minimal memories of the old Metroids. I'm saying that Super Metroid was always more Super Metroid than it was Metroid. Super Metroid occurred to me as a nostalgia vacuum. It was utterly concerned with being itself. 2.5 decades later, Super Metroid remains a milestone among masterpieces. Just about every third indie game that has ever been released lifts Super Metroid's endearingly pseudo-nonlinear structure. Today's go-to game for critical comparisons, Dark Souls, owes at least as much to Super Metroid as it does to itself. See that one of the more shocking joys of Super Metroid arrives whenever you emerge from a door to find your path has looped around and connected to a previously inaccessible area. Atop this, Super Metroid has good guns, fast action, and effortless atmosphere. If we searched for Super Metroid Review on YouTube, we would probably get about 100,000 results. I don't have time to get into everything good about Super Metroid. For now, suffice it to say that if we'd had Twitter and YouTube in 1994, commenters would have yelled at critics every time they tenuously compared another game to Super Metroid. Number 3. Tokimeki Memorial. I remember seeing a jocularly derisive snack tray blurb about Tokimeki Memorial in a magazine less glossy than Die Hard Game Fan halfway through 1994. To paraphrase,
Imagine a video game where you date girls?
the blurb scribe had likely intended the reader to fill in the blanks with a rejoinder along the lines of,
Give me a machine gun any day. Wake me up when you want me to kill something.
the blurb portrayed Tokimeki Memorial as a quaint curiosity. However, deep within the shotgun blast of my dense hair, my brain bubbled like butter on a hot cast iron skillet. I wouldn't play Tokimeki Memorial until the summer of 2003, though its name alone sustained my imagination as a thought experiment for those 9 years. A game where you date girls? Why not? Why not also a game where you wait tables at a restaurant? Why not a game where you manage a retail store? As of 1994, I, a massive fan of the Final Fantasy series, as someone who'd played enough Monkey Island to decide its jokes were too similar to the ones the priest made in church, I needed no sales pitchery on the power of video games as narratives. One screenshot of Tokimeki Memorial was enough to give me the most resounding why not possible. Tokimeki Memorial did not by a long shot invent adventure games. Tokimeki Memorial didn't even invent first-person Japanese anime-style point-and-click adventure games. It wasn't even the first Japanese video game to have dating in it. What it was a lavish, grand gesture. Tokimeki Memorial was Konami, the makers of Castlevania and Contra, making a high-profile, high-budget game not about slaughtering demons with throwing axes or murdering aliens with a laser gun. Tokimeki Memorial saw Konami's developers applying their proven expertise and sensibilities to a roundly polished experience of another nature. I've included several Konami games on this list, so allow me to pause for a moment to crown Konami, perhaps the most 1994ian of video game publishers, as video game prom monarch for 1994. In 1994, Konami polished their shiniest jade, innovated in sometimes invisible areas, expanded their flagship franchises to a new console, and invented the modern Japanese dating simulator. From where I stood in 1994 as a player of Castlevania, Contra, and Sparkster, and as a reader of magazines breathlessly touting CD game experiences like Tokimeki Memorial and Snatcher, I saw every reason to believe that even 25 years later, Konami would still be the biggest, best, brilliantest maker of video games of all time. And I would have been disastrously wrong. And that is perhaps the most 1994-ish thought of them all. Also, now that we're up to the top 2, let's do a quick rundown of the scorecard. In other words, if ever there were a time to say it, this would be that time. So yes, it's time for Daddy's Bingo. Let's start with Konami. We've just crowned Konami Video Games Class of 1994 Prom Monarch. In addition to sounding prosaically fancy, that title also has a scientific backbone. The title of Video Game Prom Monarch can only be bestowed upon a video game publisher with 4 games in the top 10 of a top 25 list. I don't make the rules, and neither do you. Exactly 4 of the games on this top 25 list are Konami games, and all 4 of those games are in the top 10. Good work, Konami. Too bad you're dead now, and I didn't even go to your funeral. Taito made 2 of the games on this list, and I love them both. Nintendo has also published 2 of the games that I've revealed so far. Maybe there's another one or 2 waiting in the wings. If we look at circa 1994, Nintendo's juggernaut of a video game console, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, however, we see that 6 of the games we've revealed so far on this top 25 list were released only on that Super Nintendo in 1994.
Well done.
On the other hand, 8 of the games we've revealed so far were published only on the Sega Genesis. Even if the top 2 games on this list are Super Nintendo exclusives, Nintendo can only hope to tie the Genesis at this point. Wow, it's almost as though both consoles were great. However, if we look at games published by Sega, including the arcade games Daytona USA and Wing War, for example, we see that Sega themselves published 5 of the games on this list. And if we add those 2 arcade games to the list of Genesis games, we can say that 10 games out of the 25 on this list were exclusive to Sega hardware. at least in 1994. Urban Strike came out on the Super Nintendo in 1995. Urban Strike probably shouldn't even be on this list. Sorry. On the one hand, I wanted to put Pulseman or Marathon on here. On the other hand, I bodily needed to represent a helicopter. Bringing up the rear on this list is Sony Computer Entertainment with exactly one PlayStation game. Wow! Talk about 25 years of play. This list contains only 5 games not developed in Japan, perhaps because Japanese games are what I personally tended to play. Also, we've covered that many Western games publishers back then were interested in making stuff like Shaq Fu. I cannot say so with a scientist's certainty, though I'm pretty sure Japanese games were better than Western games in 1994. That about concludes the crunching of the numbers. Now, let's see these top 2 games. Will the Super Nintendo achieve a tie with the Sega Genesis? Let's find out with number 2. Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III. On Thursday, December 8th, 1994, a student who would never be caught lit our high school's gym on fire. It caused millions of dollars of damages. It made the national news. School closed for 2 days. I powered all the way through Final Fantasy III during that arson-gifted 4-day weekend. When school opened again, the place was full of cops. Administrators threatened expulsion to any student showing up even 1 second late for class. From that day until the day I graduated, every morning I had to pass through a metal detector. Final Fantasy VI, released in English as Final Fantasy III, had cost me many hours of trial and worry to obtain. I had rented it a half-dozen times, each time restarting from scratch before finally being able to purchase it. So it was that when I began that 4-day weekend binge session, I did so as a mastermindedly expert at the first half of that game. Being a Super Nintendo game and a role-playing game and from Japan and having a massive heavy instruction manual, Final Fantasy III, as they called it, retailed for $79.99. That's like 140 of today's dollars. However, when Kohl's inexplicably advertised it for $52.96 in their newspaper flyer on Sunday, December 4th, 1994, I sprang into action. I crammed a box full of NES games. For the first time in my life, I had decided to part with video games on purpose. Long ago, they had been my treasures. Now, at age 15, I realized that Battletoads was a terrible video game. Thanks to its sacrifice, I obtained Final Fantasy III on December 4th, 1994. That's exactly 25 years ago to the day as I sit here typing this. And I'm reading this into a microphone on the same day that I typed it, so no one in my high school would have called me an overachiever. I did score a 4.0 GPA, though that didn't even impress my parents. I swear that I expended the absolute least and most antisocial effort possible in my pursuit of the highest marks. I treated that high school like a fast food drive-thru. Now, 25 years later, I often find myself thinking I could have done so much more. I should have joined the drama club, for example. I could have learned to play an instrument. I wasted my high school years because all I wanted in my life was to truly believe that I was too good for that place. I wasn't antisocial in a cool way because there's no such thing as being antisocial in a cool way. I was a jerk and a loser, and I deserved my haircut. The only one area of high school where I put in more effort than the teachers required was books. Only I, for some reason, never considered it academic in nature. I read literature for fun, in a way that felt like it was happening on accident. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. In December of 1994, we were reading A Tale of Two Cities in our English literature class. I could not stop there. I went ahead and read Great Expectations as well. I was in the middle of reading Great Expectations in secret during Mr. Gouldy's 10th period global awareness class there at North Central High School in Indianapolis, Indiana, when the fire alarm went off on the afternoon of Thursday, December 8th, 1994. A long weekend followed, during which I played through Final Fantasy III and thought about the work of Charles Dickens. Several late plot revelations in Final Fantasy III possessed a distinctly Dickensian flavor. Here I was, a 15-year-old who had decided he hated Battletoads, who had once been a 12-year-old who had beaten Battletoads, a 15-year-old who had played all the way through Donkey Kong Country to 101% completion while wearing a Donkey Kong Country t-shirt, a 15-year-old who had seen Pulp Fiction in a movie theater 2 months earlier and had just finished reading Great Expectations. The next day I would go back to school in what felt like a different era of a different world. I realized today that my capacity for appreciating Final Fantasy VI in 1994 might have been slightly unique. Then again, couldn't we say the same of everyone who played Final Fantasy VI in 1994? Final Fantasy VI shattered the huge expectations I took into it from my previous favorite game of all time, Final Fantasy IV, aka Final Fantasy II. These days, I say I prefer Final Fantasy IV, and I could defend this position given enough time. Though today, in memory of that day exactly 25 years ago, I will confess that Final Fantasy VI alone prevented me from quitting video games altogether the way my big brother had. Shockingly huge, structurally virtuosic, triumphantly Dickensian fanfictionian, Final Fantasy VI treated me and video games like an adult. And finally, number 1. Earthbound, or Mother 2. Earthbound came out in 1995 in the United States of America. It came out 2 days before my 16th birthday. I played it that summer. However, it came out in August of 1994 in Japan, where it was called Mother 2. I've excluded a couple of games from this list because they only came out in Japan in 1994. Well, this is my list, so I'm leaving this one on. Not only that, in a shocking twist, I'm putting it at the top. Every pure, good, playful, and literary moment that any video game has ever perpetrated exists in some crystal pristine, perfect form somewhere within Earthbound. The story of its release outside of Japan perfectly epitomizes video games of the 1990s. Earthbound arrived as the renamed sequel to a Japanese game that had not yet been released outside Japan. Its localization obscures references to its then absent predecessor. In its design, it evokes the mechanical traditions of another game, in this case its immediate predecessor and Dragon Quest, which its makers saw fit to gently embellish. Its English release involved a brazenly stupid marketing campaign. The game became a cult classic. Its huge box became a collector's item. Its eventual, structurally radical sequel came 12 long years later and was never officially translated into English. Earthbound has been dissected, deconstructed, disassembled, and put back together by legions of fans for 2.5 decades. Earthbound reached out and touched the fourth wall in a way that video games have still never gotten their fill of emulating. Sometimes obnoxiously, Earthbound has directly influenced some of the best video games in history. In this list, I have included mostly games that adhere to a small set of sensibilities and similarities. Earthbound is unlike all of them. It's unlike every game that came out in 1994. Simply seeing Earthbound detailed in video game magazines felt magical. Here was a role-playing game refreshingly set in a modern cartoon America. Simply looking at screenshots of Earthbound in magazines a year before its release filled me with the fireworks of hopeful expectation that many more unique games might someday exist. The many months I spent waiting to play Earthbound only compounded the shattering joy of its magical narrative tricks and the oppressive dread of its shockingly heavy literary themes. And maybe exactly that, for me, is 1994's most meaningful contribution to the modern hobby of video games. Joyful, turgid, oblivious expectation. Today, I spend more time looking at or thinking about video games than I do playing them. I said once on the internet that Earthbound made me a vegetarian. Obviously, I said this because I just wanted to say something dumb in an essay on the internet. The truth is, I hadn't eaten meat for many years prior to playing Earthbound. Earthbound came out 2 days before my 16th birthday. On my 16th birthday, I got a job at the local Target store on the north side of Indianapolis, Indiana. Not 20 minutes into my employment at that Target store, I faced a sudden, extremely real situation in which I had to talk to a girl. Later, she'd tell me that she was a vegetarian, and I'd say that I was a vegetarian too, because it turns out I was, and I had been for some time. I hadn't eaten meat for several years. I'd just never talked to anyone about it, especially my family. 6 months later, I'd have lost about 80 pounds by biking, swimming, running, and cutting back on the macaroni and cheese. I would work at that Target store for 7 years. I paid my way through college at that job. Earthbound was thus the final video game I acquired as a coin-scrounging, leaf-raking, snow-shoveling, lawn-mowing child who could always count on a $25 birthday check from his grandmother like clockwork, arriving every year before Memorial Day. Exactly 2 days after first playing Earthbound, I would enter the period wherein I earned my own way through life. For my next birthday, after 16 years of sending me $25 per year, my grandmother sent me $100. And then she went on a cruise, and then she died. In 1995, 1 year before my grandmother died in 1996, and 1 year after it came out in Japan as Mother 2, I played Earthbound on exhausted weekend afternoons after 8-hour morning shifts, pushing shopping carts under a hot summer sun. I played Earthbound as an almost adult who had, 1 year previous, worn a Donkey Kong Country pre-order bonus t-shirt to high school twice, played Final Fantasy VI, and seen Pulp Fiction in a movie theater thrice. In some kind of upgrowing, sweat-drained, sunburny exhaustion, my critical mind opened to Earthbound's burrowingly profound amalgamation of American cartoons and Japanese literature. I beat Earthbound late one August night after I had passed out in the parking lot under 104-degree summer heat because, I now realize, I had been starving myself in an attempt to lose weight faster. 2 months later, my big brother's best friend Jared would begin a ludicrous experiment of eating Subway sandwiches every day in between classes at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, where I would hopefully be headed in 2 years. The best part of 1994 happened in 1995. The best part of 1994 was forgetting about 1994. The best part about 1994 was facing sudden, actual adult situations in 1995. 1994 taught me how to 1995. To reiterate, in 1994, I wore a Donkey Kong Country pre-order bonus t-shirt into a high school twice, and sweatpants into that same high school 100 times or more. 1995 gave me a driver's license, a job, my mom's terrible old car, jeans, a girlfriend, six-pack abs, and Earthbound. The most critically important video game experience I would ever have. It's safe to say I started experimenting with writing novels because of Earthbound. And now, 24 years later, I'm still talking about Earthbound. In other words, Earthbound did not exactly make me a vegetarian. However, Earthbound did not make me an adult. And you know what? Despite my thinking about Earthbound just about every other day, I have not played all the way through that game in over 10 years. Maybe I should do that soon. Maybe I'll even document the entire process. Heck, I bet my complete, robustly organized thoughts concerning Earthbound would just barely fit into the script for an in-depth 3-hour video review. I wonder if it would be possible for me to make something like that someday. Well, until next time, remember, I was born stupid. However, I will not die hungry. Video games forever, Kotaku.com.